Hey, good morning. I want to welcome everyone back. We had a great start to the day with our previous panel. Thank you to everyone involved in that work. And I'm looking forward to welcoming the next panel to the stage momentarily. Before I do that, I just want to thank everyone who is a stakeholder of one of these projects that our students serve. Thank you for participating and providing some mentorship to our students and for being here to celebrate their accomplishments. We also appreciate everyone who has traveled from a good distance to be here. Thank you for the investment you are making in our students' lives and in this program. Without further ado, I am privileged to invite to the stage Amanda, Kathryn, Paul, and Emma, who will be speaking to Protected and Misunderstood, Two Species Conserving and Restoring Western Landscapes. Let's give them a hand.
Thanks, Micah. So our project panel is titled Protected and Misunderstood, Two Species Conserving and Restoring Western Landscapes. My name is Paul, to my left is Emma, Kathryn, and Amanda. To start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about my species of interest, the American beaver, and I'm going to give you guys just a brief history of the American beaver in North America. Historically, pre-European settlement, beavers were between 60 to 400 million. Come the fur trade, a lot of trappers came in and beavers were driven to near extirpation over a fur hat. Towards the end of the 1900s or beginning of the 1900s, beaver populations were about 100,000 and efforts to protect them via reintroduction started to occur. And today beaver populations are between 10 and 15 million. Kathryn next will talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of beavers on the landscape.
Yes, so some of those benefits that beavers bring to the landscape are the wetlands that create habitats, they replenish groundwater, they buffer fire, which is a big deal currently in our new climate change era. They attenuate peak flows in the spring and they augment flows in the fall. However, that same landscape modification that creates that biodiversity also gets in the way of human activity a lot. So they can cause property damage, interfere with roads and trails, and with buildings and agriculture. So they are widely viewed as a pest. And now Emma will talk a little bit about the Gunnison sage-grouse.
Thanks, Kathryn. So we're all probably pretty familiar with the Gunnison sage-grouse being in Gunnison. They were discovered as a subspecies from the greater sage-grouse in the year 2000 by our very own Dr. Jess Young and her team of researchers, which is amazing. They basically found that they had significant genetic differences as well as size, plumage, and mating calls. Once this differentiation was clear, they found that obviously the population size was much smaller than they expected, as they face a number of challenges, including anthropogenic factors, predation, habitat fragmentation, drought, which decreases their food and water supply. And then in 2014, they were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, which was extremely controversial and kind of sparked a whole new era of conservation and the fight for the Gunnison sage-grouse. They're considered an umbrella species, so basically because they are a sagebrush obligate species, they rely solely on sagebrush as a crucial part of their diet. So by conserving and protecting their habitat, we're also protecting the habitat of many other species, including big game, lots of insects and other bird species, as well as smaller mammals.
So our project panel is titled Protected and Misunderstood. And as Emma was mentioning, to the Gunnison sage-grouse, it was misunderstood that it was not the same species as the greater sage-grouse. As with the beaver, it was misunderstood that the beaver was seen as a commodity and a nuisance. Today, practitioners are learning that by protecting these species, we can actually alleviate a lot of the environmental issues to Western landscapes, be it building resilience to wildfire, alleviating issues with water shortages. So by promoting these species on the landscape, we are actually solving helping alleviate some of these issues. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Emma, and she's going to talk about some of the work that she did with the Gunnison sage grouse.
Okay. So my project was titled Wet Meadow and Riparian Restoration, combating drought and erosion in San Miguel County Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. So I basically live over in Telluride, so my work is focused in San Miguel County rather than Gunnison County. Kathy Griffin gave a population update at the Gunnison Sage-Grouse Summit last fall, basically saying that our current state population is around 3,500 birds, which is down from around 4,400 birds in 2015. So 88% of those birds are going to be here in the Gunnison Basin. The second largest subpopulation is in San Miguel County at around 7% of the birds. So I'm just going to start off by giving acknowledgements because I wouldn't be here without the help of so many stakeholders. So I want to give a quick shout out to Garrett Smith, my advisor, and all of the WCU staff and faculty who really helped make this project happen. Next, San Miguel County, who hired me on as the Gunnison Sage Grouse coordinator, Hillary Cooper, Nathaniel West, Evan Phillips, and Renzo Del Piccolo, who is my community sponsor and co-coordinator. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who funded my project, and Montezuma Land Conservancy, who acted as our fiscal sponsor. Colorado State Land Board, and all of our private landowners who enabled us to do work on their land, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Whit Blair specifically, who really helped us follow the recovery implementation strategy for the Gunnison sage grouse and make sure that we're on track doing as most that we could. Okay, so just to back up a little bit here, I was hired on by San Miguel County back in April of 2022. So they received a large restore grant from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, basically split into two parts. So it was geared towards San Miguel County to hire coordinators to implement these projects, and Dolores County was our co-part. So essentially, this grant was written 3 years before I was hired and was delayed due to COVID. So the grant metrics and the budget was like completely off. I basically had to rework everything to fit in a world where inflation and just like numerous changes had happened. So basically, I looked at the metrics, I looked at the budget, and then I set my own deliverables for what I thought would be achievable in the 2022 field season. Our first work site, as you can see here, Miramonte Basin in Norwood, has active Gunnison sage grouse activity. It's connected to the Dan Noble State Wildlife Area. And then Dry Creek Basin up here has historic Gunnison sage grouse activity. It's extremely dry now, so that's made it a lot harder for them to live there, and they haven't had a wet count in several years. But first project was to build 35 Z-dike structures in Miramonte Meadows to basically successfully restore and prevent further degradation. The second objective in Dry Creek Basin was the tamarisk removal project. I wasn't super familiar with tamarisk removal speed, so I didn't really know what was achievable. So I basically just said remove a set acreage of tamarisk in Dry Creek Basin. And then my third objective was basically stakeholder outreach, successfully creating motivation again, working with sage grouse in San Miguel County, and to kind of revamp the working group, regular meetings, and really get some momentum going. So I'll start with the Miramonte Meadows project. I guess this was kind of my favorite. So Miramonte Meadows, as I said before, is connected to the Dan Noble State Wildlife Area, which has huge expanses of sagebrush. Wet meadows are vital for sage grouse. They basically migrate down in late spring and early summer with their broods. Basically, sage grouse chicks can't digest sagebrush yet, and so they come down to forage off of forbs and all these little plants, and it's super essential for their populations. So the dry Miramonte Meadows Basin shows substantial degradation through head cuts and erosion. This is caused by historic land use, cattle grazing, wagon roads, and basically once the problem starts, it just continues to erode. So Sean Connor here with Biologic was essential to my project. 2 years earlier, he did a total site assessment of Miramonte and wrote out an entire plan. And so one of the first things I did was walk the site with him. We flagged the sites, prioritized which ones he thought were the most important given the time and resources that we had. He basically gave me an 8-hour lessons on Z-dike structures, which was amazing. So for those of you who don't know, Z-dikes are basically a form of a low-tech process-based restoration. They're built rock structures. They can be built by hand, and they either act as a grade control or a reinforcement effort to slow and disperse water, spread it out across the landscape, and really allow it to soak into the water table rather than just ripping through the drainage and furthering the erosion. So we staked out 35 priority structures, and kind of that was the start of the game plan. So super lucky to have San Diego County Road and Bridge donate all the rock for this project, which was huge. We used about 6 loads with an estimate of 35 cubic yards that Sean Connor gave us. In classic fashion, things didn't go super hot at first. We had a really big rain year up in Norwood. We actually experienced 30-year rainfalls the month that the crew was supposed to hit the ground, which completely flooded our project site. So we had to do a lot of quick thinking. Luckily, SCC was super gracious and was able to push their crew back 2 weeks. Our main concern was that the ground was so saturated that we couldn't drive any heavy equipment out there without concerns of damaging the soil, basically creating further problems. The head cuts were also filled with water, and after 2 weeks, they were semi-drained, but not completely. So we basically rented a water pump, pumped the water out, and kind of just bought some mud boots and went from there. Here's the crew. I was basically on the ground with them for 2 weeks, building, supervising, and trying to keep morale high. It definitely is hard work. It's a lot of heavy lifting. On the left here, you can see a media luna. This was built at the very top of the drainage. It basically acts as a water dispersal to try and just spread the water out immediately. In the middle and on the right, you can see 2 variations of one rock dams that we built. After the 2 weeks, we ended up building 46 structures, which was way over what my original deliverable was, which was super exciting. Obviously, the Restore grant had 100 structures as their metric, and while we didn't achieve that in the first year, luckily this is a 2-year grant. We applied for an extension, got it, have money left over, and are pretty confident that we can hit that goal in the next season, which is when the grant reporting will be due. So the next project, this was ongoing for much longer. This was our Dry Creek Basin project, and it was a tamarisk removal effort. Basically, tamarisks are an invasive species that were brought over here in the 1800s. They are a flowering shrub. They're very beautiful. Originally, they used them as kind of like a bank control because they really reinforce things. Turns out it got way out of hand. They have a super deep root system, which will stabilize banks, but they stabilize them way too much because their root systems are so deep. They'll outcompete all native plants, such as willow mostly, and they will also suck so much water up that it really dries out the surrounding area. And they're super resilient, so this was a tough one. We contracted the crew for 5 weeks. It was an adult chainsaw crew. They were basically briefed on best cutting methods and herbicide application by Nate West with the BLM. We used Garlon to spray. Basically, they divided into 3 teams. One was sawing, one was spraying, and one was piling because you'll later come back and burn the piles. And it's important to spray within the first 10 to 15 minutes as the roots will absorb as much of the herbicide as they can immediately. You want them to get down as far as you can into the root surface. Here is some examples of the clearings. And just like Miramonte, we also experienced really intense flooding in Dry Creek, which was challenging. It's a very remote site. There's no service and the roads are clay with no base. So several times the crew was actually unable to reach the site, had to turn around. We had to really work with them as well. And then the last week of the hitch, they all caught COVID. So that kind of cut the project short a little bit, just a little too bad. But they ended up clearing 20 acres, which is so much if you're out there looking at it. And Nate West, who is the project lead, was actually so impressed and happy with their work. The Restore grant goal was 158 acres. So I think whoever wrote that, it wasn't specified tamarisk, it was specified an invasive. So I think maybe they were thinking cheatgrass, but that goal wasn't achievable, obviously. But on the right side, we visited a different site with tamarisk removal. You can see the resprouts. This is only a year later. So it's basically essential that we get back out there in the next field season to lop all of that respray and go from there. I also created several GIS models for this project. This is a suitable habitat index for the Gunnison sage grouse. Basically, this shows high suitability in red, low suitability in green and blue. And as you can see, this is really the Dry Creek Basin area. Here's Miramonte. This is Iron Springs, which we're planning on focusing next. I just basically compiled several different data sets in order to make this, including vegetation type, elevation, pinyon juniper encroachment, proximity to roadways, and a lot of things that basically go into what makes habitat suitable for Gunnison sage grouse, just to kind of have a map that shows that. This is the second map that I made, which shows conservation easements in San Miguel County Gunnison sage grouse habitat. I basically just compiled this so that we would have a data field of all of the different types of easements, who holds them, their contact information, and how they overlap with occupied and unoccupied habitat for Gunnison sage grouse. We're pretty motivated to really continue our stakeholder outreach and work with private landowners that have conservation easements, but don't necessarily understand what that means for the Gunnison sage grouse and how they can work with us. So luckily, I'm very excited that this project is looking very sustainable. We just submitted a federal bill grant application with so much help from Fish and Wildlife. Whipler did so much work for us that would bring in anywhere from $200,000 to $250,000 for San Miguel Basin working groups, specifically for wet meadow restoration. We feel really good about this application. We recently partnered with Rocky Mountain Wild to act as our new fiscal sponsor, which is super exciting. And basically, this grant would really solidify my position. There hasn't been a coordinator in San Miguel County for like 5 years, so it's kind of been stagnant. Now we feel that we have this momentum, and this grant would allow more capacity building, outreach, and basically would allow us to plan projects as far as 5 years into the future. If we don't get the grant, still okay. We have substantial money left over from the Restore grant, and we're planning to basically wrap up both projects that we started last field season. Dry Creek Basin, we will be retreating the tamarisks. Miramonte Meadows, I haven't been up there, it's still snowy. So I'm pretty excited to go walk the site and see how the structures have held up to a 30-year winter. With all the water movement, I'm almost certain that they will need to be monitored and reinforced. And we also had some really awesome meetings with landowners where we brought them together to kind of hear their concerns. There's a lot of frustration, a lot of questions about project sustainability, and we had great meetings discussing the recovery implementation strategy, just kind of reworking it, figuring out what our priorities are, and basically what we can just keep doing to help save the Gunnison sage grouse. Questions?
So your stakeholder meetings, curious what they look like, who is there, and what were some of your favorite challenges with stakeholder meetings?
So we held one in Dolores County first at State Line. One of our big draws was that it was catered. So Eltham loves free food. We had a huge turnout. There were 30 landowners that came. Most of them were really frustrated, and I feel wanted to voice those frustrations. They were like, we've been in this since the beginning, since pre-listing, when there was so much collaboration, and we all came together and we're doing all this work, and then it was listed and we just felt like it was a slap in the face. And then since then, there's been momentum, and then people leave. So like one of their big questions was like, are you guys going to stick around? Is this going to be long-term work? And if we do invite you to our land to help restore it, we want to make sure that there's longevity, and that if we invest time in this, it's going to be worth something. And they were also interested in, a lot of them were very, very skeptical of the federal government. So we kind of tried to like keep the state and local state and federal agencies out of it as much as we could. But the discussion was amazing. There was one landowner who has lived there for his whole life, and he was like, I used to see those birds out in my pasture, hundreds of them. And it was just really, really cool hearing the stories and hearing the discussion, and also trying to mitigate when it got really frustrating. And at first it was just so targeted on sage-grouse, and kind of wanted to step back and be like, this is also going to help your big game. Like, we don't know if you hunt on your property, but really it's about water and bringing water back to the landscape and combating drought. And I think we were also really focused on, people were like, I don't have wet meadow on my property. And it's like, well, historically you did. And there are ways that we can treat erosion and help erosion control that can potentially bring back native forests, shrubs.
And if along similar lines, I know sage grouse in general have been kind of controversial in some areas with the ranching community, but don't seem to be here, at least anymore. Well, I'm sure they were in the past. Do you think a lot of that has been due to relationship building that's occurred throughout the past couple of decades? Do you think that's because of the type of work itself and the benefits it has to that community as well, or kind of a combination of those things?
I think definitely a combination. And I think that a lot of old school ranchers care about their land so much more than people give them credit for, and care about the ecosystem and all of the wildlife. And one thing that I learned working with these people, even if we have different opinions on what overgrazing is and cattle management, is that they do want the birds on their landscape, and they actually really care about the Gunnison sage-grouse, even if, they just call them the chickens. I was out in the field one day and ran into Scott Hughes, and he was like, are you out here for those damn chickens? And I was like, yes, I am. But I think, and Renzo Del Piccolo, who's my co-coordinator, he worked with Parks and Wildlife for 30 years and is very old fashioned with kind of boots on the ground and getting coffee and going and knocking on doors. And I think that's such an important skill that, not that I lack, but that I need to work on. Picking up the phone and calling people and making the relationship, meeting with them face to face, and finding out that you have much more in common with them than you previously thought. And so I think it is relationship building first. And once you kind of gain their respect and they come to respect you and figure out your motives, that it's actually pretty easy to work with them.
Work, Emma. So Emma and I are at a little bit different points in the project management cycle, where she had these defined objectives and goals and sites and project designs. We're starting this new program in the San Miguel watershed, and we're doing a lot of planning. So I'm hoping to get to where Emma was this summer, hopefully. But my title for my project is Assessing the San Miguel Watershed for Restoration Opportunities. My name is Paul, and my community sponsor is the San Miguel Watershed Coalition. Here in the picture, we have the San Miguel River, where it meets the Dolores out in Paradox, Colorado. But where I'm located, where I was doing my project, and where the coalition is located is in the headwaters of the San Miguel in Telluride. And just breaking down the title of my project, I'm going to use the term restoration a little bit during this presentation. And the image I want you guys to all have in your head is this image on the left. It's of a beaver dam analog. So these structures are becoming very popular with restoration practitioners to bring beavers back to their historical capacity. We realize we're not going to get them back to the 60 to 400 million, but there's still a lot of capacity, especially in the Western United States, that can be filled, and we can get a lot of the good benefits that beavers bring to the landscape by putting these low-tech structures that trap sediment, build dams, and the idea is making this self-sustaining process where beavers actually come in and continue to maintain these structures. So restoration, that's what we're talking about. We're assessing restoration potential in the watershed of the San Miguel River. So I'm not just talking about the San Miguel River. A watershed is an area that is drained into a larger body of water. The larger body of water is the river of the San Miguel, but I'm also assessing the smaller tributaries, creeks, and drainages that flow into it. So looking to where we can promote beaver activity in the San Miguel watershed. So I got interested in this topic while working with the Bureau of Land Management. I worked as an aquatic technician for 2 years on the western slope of Colorado. During that time, I worked in the Montrose field office, but I covered an area between Grand Junction to Natarita. And while working with the BLM, I would travel and just go to wadable streams and collect a whole bunch of data. But while I was doing that, these two images on the left-hand side were uncommon sites that I would see on BLM land. Here we have an unmaintained road on top and a channelized stream on the bottom. And what I learned, the hydrologist at the Montrose field office, Jed Sondergaard, had told me is that when we channelize areas like the road or have a channelized creek, water follows a path of least resistance and runs very fast off the landscape, come like spring snowmelt or even just like rain events. And that's not necessarily a good thing. We want water to move inefficiently across the landscape so it's stored, infiltrates soil, and some of that water is saved in summer drier months. So Jed had told me, and I had read up about all these like really rudimentary, low-tech, low-cost manipulations you can do to a landscape to slow water down. And beavers are pro at that. They build dams. Essentially, a beaver dam is a speed bump in a river that is going to slow water down and not make it flow very fast off the landscape. So I would go back to Telluride, where I love, and I would teach snowboarding, and I found a lot of enjoyment in that. But this issue that I saw on public lands stuck in my head, and it was something I knew I wanted to work on, learn more about, continue looking for a career doing it. So at the time, I was volunteering with the San Miguel Watershed Coalition, and Adrian Bergier, the executive director of the coalition, was like, hey, I'm starting this novel restoration program where we're trying to reconnect rivers with their floodplains using low-tech process-based restoration. I was like, that sounds awesome. I'm going to do my master's and hopefully contribute to this novel program that the coalition was just beginning. And since working with the coalition, I've done a variety of tasks. I've sat on Zoom calls with stakeholders. I've helped apply for grants. I've conducted site visits on both private and public lands with people who are interested in doing this kind of work. I've helped install beaver deceivers, which those of you who don't know what a beaver deceiver is, areas where beavers are causing a nuisance to human infrastructure. You can put a pipe in the dam, and that pipe is essentially going to regulate the pond level so you can have the good benefits that beavers do, and it's not causing issues with human infrastructure. In this case, it was a road overpass in Boulder, Colorado. And lastly, what I'll talk about for the rest of this presentation is I built a habitat suitability model that's going to really help us get into assessing restoration potential in the San Miguel watershed. Before I move on, so many people I want to thank. I should have had another slide for everyone, but all these people have helped provide some sort of technical or financial support. Of course, Western isn't on here, but I got to give big thanks to my advisor, Garrett Smith, who was very patient in helping me develop a project and giving me the skills I really needed to build this GIS model. He was a GIS professor. So getting into my habitat suitability model. What is a habitat suitability model? It is what it is. It shows where there's suitable habitat for beaver on a landscape. What is suitable habitat for beaver? It's low stream gradients, nearby water, and riparian vegetation. Those are the three criteria that beaver really look for to build their dams and lodges. So I found a peer-reviewed article that helped really guide me through this process of building the model. And then I applied those same methodologies to the San Miguel watershed. I built a model using ArcGIS Pro. Those of you who don't know what ArcGIS Pro is, it's a computer software that helps you make maps, but more importantly, it lets you look at different data sets on a landscape and look at relationships between those data sets to answer questions. And so the area I was really interested in is the tributaries, rivers, ditches, drainages in the San Miguel watershed. So I took a national wetlands inventory, which I obtained from the internet, and it showed all of those rivers and drainages in the watershed. And then I put a 210-meter buffer around those rivers because that's the maximum area a beaver will move away from water. So that's my study area. That's where I was interested in looking at. We can go to the next slide. Sorry. So I had that study area, and then I just plugged other data sets into that area. So starting from the left to the right, we had food preferences, stream gradient, and distance from water. All these criteria got reclassified. So they got scored essentially. So for just as an example, for land cover or food vegetation, riparian vegetation, cottonwoods, aspens, that's beaver's primary preferred food source. So those are going to get a 9. That's the highest suitability. Medium suitability, that's like a hardwood. Beavers will eat hardwood trees like an oak, but it's not really preferred. And then conifers would be like a 1. And same ranking system for the other data sets, you know, lower stream gradients, lower percent, higher suitability, higher stream gradients, lower suitability. So what happened after I created all these maps is these 3 maps got overlapped to see where we had all of these criteria. So this is what was produced. This is my final model. Areas in green are going to be areas where you probably had those 3 criteria of low stream gradient, desirable food, close to water. Yellow might have had like 1 or 2 of those, maybe not the other. Red probably didn't have any of those criteria. After I created the model, I wanted to see how accurate it was. Did this model actually predict beaver habitat suitability well? And for the most part, I went on Google Earth, looked at satellite imagery, and areas in green had beaver, which was really cool to see. The model did a pretty good job. But models aren't perfect. There were areas that were actually irrigation ditches. So beaver aren't going to be in those areas. Farmers don't want, ranchers don't want beavers like in their active ditch, damming the water so it's not making it to their fields. So those areas could be excluded from the model. We're not going to assess potential on an irrigation ditch. But yeah, I was pretty happy with the outcome that the model did do a pretty good job identifying suitable beaver habitat. And we're using this as a planning tool. So we have a stakeholder, the Forest Service. We were talking with Megan Inu from the Norwood Ranger District, and they're like, hey, she was told us she's really interested in working with us on these projects. They have, it's with their mission statement, but they don't have an inventory of sites where we could do these projects. So we're using this model to help us strategically plan where on Forest Service lands we could potentially do this work. So what I did was I took the model and I just included areas on Forest Service lands. So that's what this picture shows. And then I analyzed the model on Google Earth and just looked at the satellite imagery to see where there was active beavers, see where I saw signs of erosion, see where the model predicted high suitability, but there wasn't beaver. Those would be areas I'd be really interested in checking out. And I made recommendations. I dropped waypoints and on these sites. And hopefully we're going to check, and I sent them to the Forest Service. Hopefully we're going to get up to some of these model selected sites in the summer and start hatching out some plans. So for my final deliverables, I presented this presentation to a lot of my stakeholders, Forest Service, BLM, CPW, contractors that we're hopefully going to work with, Ecometrics. And they were pretty positive about the methodologies and how we're using this model as a planning tool. So that felt pretty cool that they were on board with kind of our planning process. I sent these recommendations, GPS coordinates, and just some cursory notes from my analysis on Google Earth. In next steps, we're gonna conduct field visits with stakeholders to the model selected sites this summer. Hopefully during that time, we'll develop project designs. We're gonna put X amount of BDAs on this section of stream, and we'll begin any federal paperwork that needs to happen to make projects happen on public lands. And we'll continue to apply for funding to actually get to where Emma was with her project and get to implementation in the next couple of years. And with that is my presentation. I am happy to take a couple questions if I have.
Well, I do love asking questions. Have you considered with the sites that you've selected, have you looked at upstream, downstream infrastructure, culverts, bridges, intakes, ditches to see how you can protect those? So should you invite more beavers to an area, you've gotten ahead of it and made sure you protected infrastructure and work with landowners that might find beavers a nuisance, and you wouldn't want to invite a bunch of beavers just to be doomed. So yeah, just curious about that.
Right, that is, would be a very thorough analysis that I should look at. It wasn't what I was looking at in the initial analysis, but yes, we don't want to like put beaver dam analogs above an irrigation diversion. Initially, that could cause issues because beaver dams do kind of block that flow and can prevent water going into irrigation ditches, but eventually it could, in the long run, provide a hydrologic lift. But that is something that I will look at.
Yeah, my name's Amanda and I'm a MS in ecology student. And today I'll be talking about my thesis research, ecological factors influencing beaver presence in Taylor Park, Colorado. But first I want to acknowledge and thank all the support and the helpers throughout the last 2 years that helped with this project, especially high country conservation advocates for their support and funding. And then also to the Taylor Park Beavers themselves, and to Madeline, Darren, and Pat for being my badass beaver committee. So it was great, and everyone else listed. So a little bit background about beavers. So they're ecosystem engineers and a keystone species because they create, modify, and maintain not only their own habitat, but habitat for other wildlife. Around 80% of wildlife utilize riparian wetlands at some point during their annual cycle. And beavers also provide ecosystem services to humans via recreation opportunities, improved water quality, and increased biodiversity, just to name a few of many. That map in the bottom right-hand corner is the historic range of beavers in North America. Again, from the intro, due to unregulated trapping from the 18th century fur trade, led to a huge decline in the population. Trapping regulations helped initiate beavers into most of this range, but however, modifications of wetlands from human development and cattle grazing limit their recovery. And more recently, beaver restoration projects gained momentum, especially in the Western US, where due to the awareness that beavers can help combat the effects of climate change. And some of these benefits include increasing water storage and increasing ecosystem resilience. Okay, so to help aid in their recovery, researchers identified habitat characteristics important for beaver occupancy. Like Paul said, a constant water source and low stream gradients. And then researchers used these habitat characteristics and created habitat beaver dam capacity models. And capacity is defined as the amount of beaver activity, aka dams, that a stream reach could support. And then further, we have beaver restoration and mimicry to help mimic beaver benefits on the landscape and to promote suitable beaver habitat. And that photo up in the top is of the beaver restoration happening in Taylor Park. Okay, so that all sounds great. However, beaver activity is modest in some areas compared for the capacity on the landscape. So there's been limited research in identifying the ecological drivers influencing beaver presence in areas with capacity, but no current activity. And these areas are usually prioritized for beaver restoration. So we need a better understanding of beaver habitat selection in these areas to help aid in beaver recovery and restoration efforts. So the purpose of our project was to identify the ecological variables limiting beaver recovery in areas with capacity for beaver activity. We did our study in Taylor Park, Colorado, where there's a current beaver pilot restoration project going on. It's assumed that the beaver population in Taylor Park has been declining the last 15 to 20 years. And one possible reason for that would be due to drought conditions. So the objectives of our study were to document changes in beaver pond area from 1999 to 2021, and then compare that trend to the trend in drought severity. And then our second objective was to identify the ecological variables that could be limiting beaver recovery in Taylor Park. Okay, so this map shows Taylor Park in Colorado, and we conducted our research within the Taylor Park watershed boundary, which is outlined in white. And then if you're not familiar with the area, just to orient yourselves, we have Gunnison in the southwest, and then we have Aspen to the north, and then Buena Vista to the east. Okay, sorry. Okay, and then we used ecometrics model for beaver dam capacity in Taylor Park to select our field sites. So on here, the blue is beaver dam capacity, and the thicker the line, the more capacity or beaver dams that stream reach could support. And then in the green, we have current beaver activity. Again, the thicker the line, the more activity, aka beaver dams, are currently on that stream reach. And then we had 30 occupied capacity sites, which were sites that had capacity, beaver dam capacity, and current activity. So that's where the blue and green layers overlap. And those are shown by the pink circles. And then we had 30 unoccupied capacity sites. So these are sites having capacity, but no current activity, and represented by the yellow circles. And then we looked for signs, the ground truth to look for signs of current beaver activity at all our sites. And some of these are signs of beaver activity. So we have scent mounds, fresh veg cuts, ponds, dams, lodges, canals, slides, and then of course the real deal. So we have our field sites, and now we'll go on to objective one, which was how has pond area changed through the years, and how does this trend compare to the trend in drought severity? So we mapped beaver ponds on 6 years of imagery in Google Earth Pro, and then we calculated total pond area at each site for each year of imagery. And then we examined this correlation between the change in pond area and between drought severity. And these are just examples on the bottom for one of the sites. It was a lot of mapping. Okay, and then so this map shows the change in total pond area from 1999 to 2021. And you can see that there's been a decreasing trend in total pond area in Taylor Park, with 2005 having the largest total pond area and 2019 having the smallest total pond area. And then we found that total pond area was not correlated to our drought conditions and drought severity. And down here below the chart is our correlation coefficient of 0.38. Values closer to 0 indicate low correlation, and values closer to 1 or -1 indicate higher correlations. So in a summary, pond area varied over time, but showed a decreasing trend in pond area, and suggesting that beavers are not expanding into the available habitat. One reason for this is there could be a relatively low beaver density in Taylor Park, and you would expect less resource availability pressures and therefore less expansion into surrounding habitat. And then also change in pond area was not correlated to drought, suggesting that drought might not be the cause to the decline in the population, suggesting that there could be another reason for it, and that'll take us to our second objective, which is what is limiting beaver recovery in Taylor Park. So we collected habitat covariates important for beaver occupancy, which are listed in this table and selected based off just doing literature research. And then we also used logistic regression to examine the relationship and see which habitat covariates were important for beaver occupancy in Taylor Park. So these are just photos of collecting data in the field. Just some to highlight, this is collecting stream gradient. And then this is the cover board that we made and used to collect all our habitat covariates. And these are just examples in Taylor Park. So our top model had an additive effect of past beaver presence, percent willow cover, and riparian vegetation width. So these figures show predicted beaver occupancy for sites on the left with past beaver presence and then sites with no past beaver presence. And just to orient yourselves, we have predicted beaver occupancy on the Y here, percent willow cover on the X, and then riparian vegetation width is the minimum, medium, and then maximum based off of the different colored lines. So basically at sites with past beaver presence, as percent willow cover and your riparian vegetation width increases, so does predicted beaver occupancy. But then we can see on the right, when you don't have any, there's no past beaver presence, predicted beaver occupancy was less than 1%, and percent willow cover and riparian vegetation width had little influence on occupancy. Sorry. Okay, so in conclusion, past beaver presence is driving the beaver occupancy bus. All 30 of our occupied sites had past beaver activity, whereas only 14 of our unoccupied sites had past beaver activity. And again, at sites with no past beaver activity, predicted beaver occupancy was less than 1%. And then 16 of our 30 unoccupied sites had no past beaver activity, suggesting that these sites maybe could not contain suitable beaver habitat or very low quality habitat, and that these beaver capacity models could potentially be overestimating beaver capacity on the landscape. And other studies found that these capacity models can misinterpret the beaver habitat selection patterns in suboptimal habitats where these restoration efforts are prioritized. And just for example, these bottom two photos were two of my unoccupied sites where I would just suggest that these are low quality beaver habitat, and especially just for dam building capabilities. So this research can help inform the pilot beaver restoration project currently going on in Taylor Park and other restoration projects happening throughout the Western US, like in the San Miguel Basin. And beaver restoration and mimicry is important, especially if beavers are selecting and preference sites with past beaver activity. However, it might not be worth implementing a restoration project if the beaver population is not growing. So the next steps for beaver recovery in Taylor Park would be to identify if beavers are not recovering because the population is not growing, or if beavers are not recovering because it's actually not suitable habitat. And then in the future, managers should compare the habitat characteristics at relic beaver sites versus occupied beaver sites, since beavers are selecting for past activity, and it'll give a better understanding of what habitat characteristics beavers are selecting for when colonizing an area. And then that photo on the bottom right is of Liam Dugan, an example of how hard it is to walk through beaver wetland complexes, and you fall in a lot of unseen canals. So just be careful out there. And then with that, I thank you, and then I'll take any questions.
Question. I know that sometimes beaver dam analogs will attract beavers to create a dam in that place. And since the presence of past beavers is so influential for where beavers established. Is there anything that can be done besides the BDA in that area to help incentivize beavers to set up camp?
Yeah, so yeah, the question was, is there anything else that could be done to help incentivize beavers moving in on an area besides building beaver dam analogs? And specifically, I can talk about Taylor Park, just it being a high elevation basin. And just with all the freezing temperatures, beavers rely on building food caches for overwinter survival. So one possible, and since percent willow cover was important when there was past activity at an area, you could do, my idea when I thought about it was doing willow plantings. However, with all the cattle grazing that's happening, it's like really hard. And I think there's a lot of mixed results on how successful doing those willow plantings are. But there's also other low-tech process-based structures that you can build. But I think the BDAs, there's beavers that moved in on the restoration and BDAs that were put up last summer already. So seems like the best option, I guess.
If we have time for questions. When you look at past history, what if beavers hadn't been there for 100 years? Do you think you could still pick up evidence of them? You know, when you were saying maybe we're overestimating, could it be also that beavers have been gone so long and things have changed so much that it would be hard to actually pick up past it?
Yeah, and that's the one thing we didn't, it was if you'd be hard to, question was if it'd be hard to pick up past beaver activity, like 100 years in past imagery. And that was the one, I guess, caveat or one of the limitations is for all the study area, I looked for past imagery and I had to use just what was on Google Earth Pro because there wasn't enough to actually cover all of Taylor Park in historic imagery. And I think that's a really good question. I think it might not be I don't think it'd be how long beavers haven't been there, but maybe how degraded, like what they did rather than the time is just like what am I trying to say? Like how maintained or still from what they did in the past, like if that is still shown, like with beaver meadows and stuff. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Benson, and my project developed and collected data for beaver-based restoration work being done in Taylor Park. And before I start, I have to acknowledge all the people that my project wouldn't have been possible without. Ashley Hall, my sponsor, Allison Del Gizzi, her right-hand woman, Brett Henderson and Eli Smith with High Country Conservation Advocates who provided funding, Dr. Garrett Smith, my mentor, Dr. Micah Russell, Dr. Madeline Vanderkirk, Dr. Robin Bingham, botanist extraordinaire, and Amanda Aulenbach for her on-the-ground knowledge that really helped me when I was getting started. And there's so many other people, botanists and collaborators from Rocky Mountain Biological Lab and the Bureau of Land Management and other students. And last but not least, my family and my partner, Eric, who I would not have been here today without their support. This is a picture of Taylor Park. This is a rudimentary map. And on the left here, Trail Creek is where they have already started doing some restoration work. And I was on Red Mountain Creek, just across the road, basically. Taylor Park contains many of the headwater streams for the Taylor River, which ends in the Taylor Reservoir. Well, the headwaters end in the Taylor Reservoir right there. And it's a beautiful high altitude valley. It has sagebrush steppe, montane meadows, and lodgepole pine forests. But one of the most important things that it has are those riparian ecosystems. And their health is critical to wildlife populations in the area. It supports water use for agriculture and recreation, fishing and rafting. Drought is worsening across the western slope. and everywhere almost. And of course, fires are becoming more frequent and intense. So these mitigations like Paul was talking about, and Amanda, especially beaver-based restoration, might become increasingly important tools. Beaver-based restoration includes those beaver dam analogs that Paul showed you and other low-tech processes. Some of the beaver deceiver structures that can keep beavers from building in culverts, just kind of fencing that confuses them. And then there's also the pipes that run through the dams. And the main goal is to get the beaver back on the landscape because they're really good at this work. So this is my favorite picture that I took the whole time. And it was just above my plot that's closest to the road, which you will see does not look like this. I just walked through a clump of willow to be surprised by this view. And often beaver dam complexes don't always look like your idyllic mountain stream that you might have in your head, especially from a comfortable viewing distance, which this was not. And as Amanda showed us, that good cover of willow kind of obscures things that the beaver prefer. So I got the opportunity to talk to some folks about this that we're recreating on the landscape. There was one day when I was out laying tapes on my plot and the cows had wandered into the valley. I was in my plot that was furthest from any trails or roads. And I was using some colorful language towards my meter tapes and chastising cows. And 2 bow hunters appeared behind me and asked if I needed any help. So I had a little heart attack. And then I got to talk to them. They asked if the Forest Service was trying to straighten the creek out, which is the opposite of what we want. So I got to talk about how the goal is a messier creek, re-wetting the meadows, and creating habitat for the wildlife that they love to hunt, but elk and deer. I don't think I mentioned beavers specifically because of their misunderstood status. And then I sent a comforting picture to my mother that I would not, hold on. There we go. I would not be hunted unless there's a woodland clown season, and then maybe. I think she said I looked like a children's Halloween party. Okay. So this is kind of some pictures of some plot selection that we did. And we selected plots, Ashley and I, that had kind of that wider valleys, had that past beaver activity, and where there was kind of a lesser impact to structures, roads, trails, or with plans to change that. And then we had a wilderness area, so we kind of avoided the wilderness area because you can't do as much on that. I have opinions you can hear about if you would like. And so 3 sites were identified as suitable, and then 1 to 2 plots were established. And I chose to focus on wetland indicator status, so that's that bottom left table. And it's for the Western Valleys, Mountains, and Coasts region, which is kind of a incongruous region, but that's where we are for those classifications. And also that overall in the native biodiversity to give a good idea of the habitat that was available. And then plot layout, I used the Bureau of Land Management's wetland system protocol, and the transverse layout was selected, which makes sense. That's what's suggested for these headwater streams. So that's on the top left over there. It has 3 line points, surveys, and then the whole plot area for biodiversity. And the first one. This is the plot that's closest to Road 742. This has had beaver dams removed repeatedly because they are getting in the way of the Bat Road 742 and 742E that goes up to the trail that's up there on Red Mountain Creek. And it also has a few, I don't know how old these channels are, but it's been channelized. There's been like dikes that have been built to divert the water. And some of the restoration strategies, since beaver are actively wanting to get into that area, are some of those beaver deceiver structures and kind of expanding out that wet meadow area. In this plot, it had the tallest of the species of willow that I found. A little background on willow. They are extremely difficult to identify, so they need to be examined throughout the year. And for now, I'm just calling this tall silver willow. But it had a 47% of my line point data was this willow cover. But bare ground was also the most prominent in this site. So it was 33% of my ground cover. Much of that bare soil appeared to be the beaver dams that had been drained repeatedly over the years. I would see dams and sometimes even lodges and stuff like that. In this area, there was more forb species that were described as weedy, even if they were native, or occurring in disturbed soil. And it had the most of the non-native species that I found. I only found about 3. And that was the common dandelion, white clover, and Kentucky bluegrass. And they're all classified as naturalized. So in general, I didn't see any big problems with non-native species. This plot also had the lowest plant diversity of 30 species. And then this is moving upstream. We call this one the crossing plot because it crosses the trail that goes there. And it was dominated also by willow, but a shorter species of willow. It had a larger proportion of line point hits of water birch, Betula glandulosa, which is classified as obligate wetland. But it also had more grasses in proportion to the Kieras that are kind of more indicative of the wetland habitat. And this had 42 species, which is kind of in the middle. Oh yeah, and this would actually probably have some beaver dam analogs installed. And then the trail is real low in that area, so the trail would have to be raised up. So we talked about that a little bit. Thank you. And then this is my furthest upstream. It's kind of a little closer to the wilderness area. You can kind of see an overview of the upper plot, and then this is kind of closer to the lower plot. And also shows the active beaver activity that was ongoing while I was there. They had kind of a similar composition of grasses to that crossing plot, but higher grass cover. And they had more instances of the shrubby cinquefoil, Dasyphora fruticose. And Ashley identified that as being one of the species that she uses to indicate that a meadow is drying out and needs rewetting. Oh yeah, so interestingly, kind of further downstream, the upstream plot 2 had 50% proportion of grasses and sedges, which I think is kind of an indicator of that draining out. It also had the highest diversity of plant species, so it had 46 species, and it was a slightly smaller area. I just thought it was a really interesting area. I think that there's a stream that could reconnect and wet that meadow. It kind of divides, Red Mountain Creek divides there. And like I said, there was recent ongoing beaver activity. And it's worth noting that this was the furthest off trail. All the other ones were about 100 meters away or less. And next I'll look at my obligate wetland plant data. So obligate wetland is in dark blue there. Those are the plants like this one that's in the water that have the adaptations to having wet roots, you know, and living completely submerged a lot of times or in very wet soil. And then you have facultative wetland, which are kind of the ones that you'd find in a wet meadow in the light blue. Facultative and facultative upland are kind of generalist species in green. And we have a little bit of upland species that are more evolved to tolerate dry conditions. So the road plot had 37% combined obligate and facultative wetlands. Crossing had 30%, and upstream plot 1 had 41. Upstream 2, which is a little further away from the beaver activity, had 33%. I do think it's interesting. This is not enough data to draw scientific conclusions, but the plots with 37 and 33%, 41% were the closest to the active beaver activity. So, and I believe with that, I will take any questions that you have and show you some pretty pictures of one fungus and some plants.
Kathryn, for the sake of time, we need to move into panel questions.
I was paying attention.
Now is an opportunity for anyone on Zoom or anyone in the room to ask questions of any of the individuals in the panel or the panel as a whole. Does anyone want to start us off? Miss Courtney.
This was for Kathryn, but maybe other people can comment. Do you think that the restoration of or creation of wildlife habitat should or realistically could be used to justify management in wilderness areas?
I personally think so, yeah. We had an interesting opportunity in one of our classes to see some restoration work that was being done in New Mexico in a wilderness area. And it just had a startling impact, honestly. And I think that assessing some of those, especially these low-tech process-based restoration tools, they're very unobtrusive. And I don't think that they would affect the character of the wilderness.
Thank you. Other questions? Please.
This is for Paul and Emma. Did you guys have a certain ranking for your suitability analysis maps?
Yeah, I used the same ranking. The question was, did we have a certain ranking for our suitability maps? And I used the same ranking system that was in the peer-reviewed article. So it was 0 through 9. And then everything, I think I forgot to mention it in the presentation, but everything was weighted too. So there are characteristics that are more important to beavers, like being nearby water and stream gradient and specifically. So that weighted sum was applied before for the additive model.
Yeah, I also used a ranking. Basically, vegetation type was pretty much the most important, as well as elevation. Sage grouse kind of need it kind of in the middle. They can't be too high or too low, as well as land type, land ownership. So everything was ranked, everything was weighted when the data was compiled.
Thank you. Ashley?
Yeah, has anyone merged the data looking at suitability habitat for beaver and suitability habitat for Gunnison sage grouse to see where that like little magic might happen, especially around funding and support?
I have not merged.
Do that.
We should
Good idea.
I think it's a great suggestion.
Next, right?
Yes, next year. Anyone else? John?
We've got time. I've got a question.
Yes, please.
This is kind of a beaver focused question, but also applies to everything that the panel was working on. I'm curious if all of the restoration work and kind of categorizing work that you all did is a step in like a longer process And if so, could you kind of highlight some of like the next steps that, even if they may be like 50 years out, kind of what are they?
It's definitely a first step in a much longer process. These structures are, they're, not permanent by nature. So they get blown down. I think even after implementation, you should still go out, check the structures, look and see if beavers are moving in. And I've read some articles that this is kind of a newer method of restoration. So it still maybe doesn't have like the backing that it need, or the science to back it. So we do need more people doing like, what Amanda's doing monitoring and just making sure what we're doing is effective. And then, Ashley brought up the whole thing with landowners. I think constantly checking in with landowners and making sure water rights aren't, that's a big thing in the West Coast, aren't being abused, and making sure everyone's like on board throughout the whole process.
Yeah, so like specifically with like the BDA work, it's like if you're going to implement those structures, it's with the intent that beavers are going to move in and take over. So you really are looking at to implement something that, you aren't going to have to come back and look at, and beavers are going to be there. And then like they basically farm their own habitat and just create more willow and help with regeneration and stuff like that. And then with like the wet meadow stuff, I worked on a crew this past summer, and a lot of times we went back, like our structures that we implemented, that were implemented before, or even like 10 years before. I think it was started in like 2012 or something. We went back and we built on top of those structures, because then soil's coming in and aggregating, and then like you need to build your structure higher so that you can keep lifting up and stopping that incision. So it is a lot of just upkeep on your structures, and then hopefully potentially adding more to help aggregate.
I also wanted to quickly mention that I was not really able to find any research on like monitoring these kind of restoration projects yet. So more of that would be good.
I also just want to add quickly, I meant to touch on this earlier, that I think for the sake of project sustainability, it's really important to get landowners involved so that they feel connected to the project and are excited about it. So on our wet meadow restoration project, we contracted the lessee to basically stage our rock. So once he was like more involved and helping us spread the rock out throughout the pasture and getting paid for it, like he was really excited and was checking in and is still checking in about this next field season, because he suddenly is like involved in a much more hands-on way and meeting the crew and getting to see the results really directly. So I think the relations are a really big part of project sustainability.
Yeah, that was a great, and it made me think, restoration too isn't just for the land too. I look at restoration for your soul too. And it just reminded me of that with the landowner being involved. And that's what happened to me. Like I started working doing restoration, and you get to restore the place and the landscape and also yourself while you're doing it.
We have 2 minutes, time for Brennan.
As a part of you guys saying like engaging landowners, the restoration of these habitats really intended to improve the water table and actually increase water throughout the season. While there might be an initial disruption, especially in landowners' water right, how does that conversation and education component work, and how can you better engage with landowners to communicate that information that there might be initial disruption, but over time, these types of projects are really beneficial and will support the landscape?
I can speak on that really quick. So at one of our landowner meetings, one of our tactics was to kind of steer the conversation away from the sage grouse and kind of reorient it to water, because regardless of your stance on the bird, I think we can all agree that everyone wants more water on their landscape, especially if it's a grazing operation. If they hunt for any reason, they're all interested in getting water back to their landscape. So when you kind of focus it in terms of drought and in terms of your landscape's resiliency, I think people are much more open to it and much more excited about it, even if they don't really care specifically about the Gunnison sage grouse. So that was like a crucial talking point and method for me.
I'll just add, the question was, what can be done for outreach to landowners who might be getting disrupted, particularly with water rights, as a result of these process-based restoration projects? And one thing that you can do is just address their concerns right away. We talked about it in Russ Japontovich's NEPA class. I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Russ. But, you know, address that concern right away. If they're worried that the beaver dam is going to disrupt their water right and they're not going to get their allocation, you change the project timeline and maybe, you know, you start implementation during a non-water year. And then hopefully by the time you get spring runoff, maybe the system has already responded, but that's one thing that you can do. And then just reiterating like the science that has kind of promoted this stuff is like it can augment flows into summer seasons, which will extend your irrigation season, I think is important if they're not already aware of that.
We're going to need to leave it there. Let's congratulate this panel.